The auction hall smelled of candle wax and cold perfume, and Rian Calloway stood on the wooden stage with his wrists bound in silk rope, feeling something no boy his age should ever feel: calm. His heart did not race the way it should have. His breath did not shake the way everyone around him expected it to. He had done this before. Not this exact auction, not this exact haul, but this feeling, this exact kind of helplessness dressed up in candlelight and gold coins, had happened to him in a life before this one, and in a life before that, stretching back further than he could count. He was 20 years old in this lifetime, with soft brown hair that fell over tired eyes, and a body that had learned to stay still when the world wanted to break it. The crowd below him were nobles in fine coats, fanning themselves, whispering behind gloved hands about the boy on the stage who did not cry. They liked that he did not cry. It made him seem exotic, unusual, worth a higher price. Rian barely heard the numbers being shouted. He was somewhere else in his mind, somewhere far behind his own eyes, remembering a different stage, a different rope, a different pair of eyes staring up at him from the crowd with the same aching hunger they had carried the very first time this happened, centuries ago, though no history book would ever write that number down. Then the room went quiet. A man in a long black coat trimmed with silver stepped forward, and every noble in the hall lowered their fans and their whispers at once. Rian did not need anyone to tell him who this was. He felt it in his chest before his eyes even lifted to meet him. Prince Kalen Draven, 24 years old, crown prince of a kingdom that feared him more than it loved him, walked toward the stage with the same slow, deliberate steps Rian remembered from lifetimes ago, though back then he wore different clothes and carried a different title. The face was changed in small ways, sharper here, softer there, but the eyes had not changed at all. Cold on the surface, and underneath that cold, something starving. Kalen did not speak to the auctioneer. He simply lifted 2 fingers, and the price soared past anything anyone else in the room could afford, and just like that, the bidding ended before it truly began. Rian was led down from the stage and into the prince's carriage without a single word exchanged between them, and as the wheels began to turn against the cobblestones, Rian pressed his bound hands quietly into his lap and allowed himself, for the very first time that night, to breathe. The palace was colder than Rian expected, though he was not surprised. Grand hallways stretched in every direction, lined with portraits of kings who all wore the same unreadable expression Kalen wore now, as if cruelty and loneliness had been passed down like a family heirloom nobody wanted but everyone inherited anyway. A young guard named Soren Whitlock, 22 years old with a kind face and sharp eyes, was the one who finally untied the rope from Rian's wrists, his fingers gentle in a way that surprised them both. "You are safe here," Soren said quietly, glancing toward the door where the prince had already disappeared. "He does not hurt the ones he buys. He just does not know what to do with them either." Rian only nodded, rubbing the marks left behind on his skin, though his mind was elsewhere, tracing the shape of a memory that refused to stay buried. He was given a small room near the east wing, simple but clean, with a single window that looked out over a quiet garden. That night, lying on unfamiliar sheets in an unfamiliar bed, Rian closed his eyes and let the memories rise fully to the surface for the first time since he arrived. He remembered a version of Kalen who once held his hand beside a river that no longer existed in this world. He remembered whispered promises made under a different sky, promises that were shattered not because Kalen stopped loving him, but because someone else made sure that love could never survive. A man with a warm smile and cold intentions, a man Rian now knew walked the halls of this very palace under the name Duke Ashbourne Reyes, 29 years old, a nobleman trusted by nearly everyone except the one person who should never have trusted him in the first place. Rian did not know yet how history had repeated itself in every lifetime that followed, only that it always ended the same way, with Kalen's heart turned to ice by lies, and Rian left to watch him become someone colder than he was ever meant to be. This time, lying in the dark with the weight of centuries pressing quietly against his ribs, Rian made himself a single promise. "This time, no matter how long it takes, I will not let it happen again." Days passed slowly inside the palace walls. Rian was given small tasks, tending to linens, helping in the kitchens, staying mostly out of sight, though he often found his gaze drawn toward the West Tower where the prince spent most of his hours locked away with maps and ledgers and the quiet burden of ruling a kingdom that did not love him. Kalen rarely looked at him directly, and when he did, his eyes would narrow slightly, as though searching for something he could not name. One afternoon, while Rian was crossing through the east garden with a basket of folded cloth balanced against his hip, he passed beneath a row of blooming jasmine, and the smell hit him so suddenly that his knees nearly buckled beneath him. It was the exact same scent from that memory beside the river, the scent that had clung to Kalen's coat the very last time they touched before everything fell apart. Rian stopped walking entirely, his fingers tightening around the basket, his breath caught somewhere between his throat and his heart. Kalen, who happened to be walking the same path that day for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, noticed the boy standing frozen beneath the flowers, his face pale, his eyes glassy with something that looked far too much like grief for someone Kalen had only just met. "Are you unwell?" Kalen asked, his voice flat but not unkind. Rian blinked quickly, forcing the memory back down where it belonged, and shook his head. "I am fine, Your Highness. The flowers just reminded me of somewhere I used to know." Kalen studied him a moment longer than necessary, something unfamiliar tugging quietly behind his ribs, a feeling he did not have the language for yet. Without another word, he continued down the path, though he found himself glancing back once before disappearing around the hedges, and Rian, still trembling faintly beneath the jasmine, understood with quiet certainty that some part of Kalen remembered too, even if he did not yet know what it was that he remembered. That night, as the palace settled into silence and the stars scattered themselves across a sky untouched by either of their sorrows, Rian sat by his window with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the candlelight flicker in the west tower where Kalen still worked long after everyone else had gone to sleep. He thought of every version of this story that came before, every ending that broke his heart in exactly the same place, every time Ashbourne's lies had turned love into ash before it had the chance to bloom fully. But this time, Rian told himself, watching that single flame burn steady against the darkness, this time he was not just a boy who remembered. This time he would be the one who changed the ending, no matter what it cost him, no matter how long the fight would take, because some loves are worth chasing across every lifetime it takes to finally get them right, and Rian intended to prove that this one, finally, would be the one that stayed. The garden had become Rian's quiet refuge in the weeks that followed, a small patch of earth where jasmine still bloomed heavy and sweet, though he had learned to breathe through the ache it stirred in his chest each time the scent reached him. He no longer avoided it. He had decided instead to let the memories come and go like clouds passing over the sun, present but never powerful enough to block the light completely. It was in this garden, on a cool morning with mist still clinging to the grass, that Kalen found himself walking again, drawn by a pull he still refused to name. He found Rian kneeling beside a bed of white flowers, humming something soft under his breath, a tune that seemed to belong to no song Kalen had ever heard, and yet it settled into his chest as though it had always lived there. Kalen stood a moment at the edge of the path, watching the boy work with careful hands, trimming dead petals away from healthy stems, and something in his chest loosened just slightly, like a knot untying itself one thread at a time. "You hum when you work," Kalen said, his voice quieter than he intended. Rian looked up, startled but not afraid, and offered a small smile that reached his tired eyes. "It helps me forget the parts of the day that were hard, Your Highness. My mother used to say a hum is a promise to your own heart that things will get softer soon." Kalen said nothing to that, though the words settled somewhere deep and unfamiliar inside him, a place he had long since sealed off from anything resembling comfort. He turned to leave, as he always did, retreating before feelings could catch up to him, but something made him pause at the edge of the garden path. "Walk with me," he said, not quite a command, not quite a request, something caught uncertainly between the two. Rian rose to his feet, brushing soil from his knees, and followed the prince through the winding paths of the garden in a silence that felt, for the first time since his arrival, almost peaceful rather than heavy. Kalen walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders carrying the same rigid posture he wore in every hallway of the palace, but his steps were slower here, less like a ruler inspecting his kingdom and more like a boy trying to remember what it felt like to simply exist without the weight of a crown pressing down on him. They passed beneath an arch of climbing roses, and Kalen spoke without looking at him, his voice low, almost as though the words were escaping before he could stop them. "My father used to walk this same path with my mother, before she passed. I do not remember her voice anymore, only that she used to hum while she walked, much like you did just now." Rian's heart ached softly at the confession, not because it surprised him, but because he recognized the shape of that loneliness, having carried pieces of it himself across every version of this story that came before. "I am sorry, Your Highness. Losing a mother's voice must feel like losing a piece of home you can never rebuild." Kalen glanced at him then, something flickering behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or simply the rare comfort of being understood without needing to explain further. Most people offer sympathy that sounds rehearsed. Yours does not. "I have lost people too," Rian said quietly, choosing his words with care, unwilling to reveal the full truth of centuries hidden behind his eyes, but willing to offer this small honest piece of himself. "I know what it feels like when grief settles into your bones and refuses to leave quietly." They continued walking without speaking for a while after that, and something between them shifted subtly, like a door left slightly open that had once been locked entirely shut. From that day onward, Kalen began to seek Rian's company in small, quiet ways, never announcing it, never explaining it even to himself, simply appearing wherever Rian happened to be, in the kitchen gardens, in the library halls, in the quiet courtyard where morning light spilled gently over stone benches. Rian, in turn, began offering small kindnesses without expectation of anything in return. He would leave a warm cup of tea outside the study door when Kalen worked late into the night. He would fold the prince's coat properly when servants left it carelessly draped over furniture. He would speak gently during the moments when Kalen's temper flared from exhaustion, never flinching from the sharpness in his voice, never taking the harshness personally, understanding instead that it came from a place of deep, practiced loneliness rather than true cruelty. Soren noticed the change before anyone else in the palace dared to acknowledge it. He watched Kalen's shoulders relax slightly whenever Rian entered a room, watched the prince's eyes soften in ways they had not softened in years, and he said nothing to anyone, choosing instead to quietly support the growing bond by covering for Rian's absences when the prince requested his company during hours he should have been resting. "You are good for him," Soren told Rian one evening, as they stood together near the stables, watching the sun sink low behind the palace towers. "I have served him since we were children, and I have never seen him choose to be near someone the way he chooses to be near you." Rian smiled softly at that, though a quiet sadness lingered behind his expression, the weight of knowing things Soren could never understand, the weight of remembering a love that had been broken before and might be broken again if history repeated its cruel pattern. "I only want him to remember what it feels like to be cared for without conditions attached. Everyone in his life wants something from him. I do not want anything except his peace." "That is rarer than you know," Soren replied, his voice quiet with genuine respect, "and rarer still in a place like this." One evening, weeks after their first walk together, Kalen found Rian sitting alone in the library, curled into a window seat with a book resting unopened in his lap, his eyes distant, lost somewhere far beyond the pages. Kalen sat across from him without asking permission, something he rarely did in his own home, always commanding rather than joining, but tonight he simply wanted to be near him. "You carry sadness sometimes," Kalen said carefully, watching Rian's face for any reaction. "Even when you smile, something behind your eyes stays heavy. I recognize it because I carry the same thing." Rian met his gaze fully then, feeling the weight of centuries pressing gently against his ribs, wanting desperately to explain everything, the past lives, the broken promises, the love that had been stolen from them again and again by lies dressed up as friendship. But he knew the truth would sound impossible, and worse, he feared it might frighten away the fragile trust they had only just begun building. "I have lived through more sorrow than most people my age should carry," Rian said instead, choosing honesty without revealing everything. "But I have also learned that sorrow does not have to be the only thing that defines a person. Sometimes healing starts simply by choosing, every single day, to let someone else in a little further than the day before." Kalen studied him in the candlelight, something unfamiliar and warm spreading slowly through his chest, a feeling he had spent years convincing himself a crown prince had no right to feel. "Then let me be someone you let in," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its usual coldness, and Rian felt his heart swell with a hope so tender it nearly brought him to tears. From that night forward, something between them deepened gently, day by day, moment by moment, built not on grand declarations but on small steady acts of trust. Kalen began sharing pieces of his childhood he had never spoken of to anyone, the pressure of ruling before he was ready, the isolation of a throne that offered power but never comfort. Rian listened without judgment every time, offering quiet warmth in return, carrying his secret patiently, waiting for the right moment to let the whole truth finally surface. And though neither of them spoke the word aloud yet, something had begun blooming quietly between them, delicate as the jasmine in the garden, patient as the seasons changing outside the palace walls, a love that had waited centuries to be given a fair chance to grow, finally finding soft, careful roots in this lifetime at last. Duke Ashbourne Reyes had watched the changes in the palace with growing unease, his smile never faltering in public even as something cold and calculating churned steadily behind his eyes. He had spent years positioning himself close to the throne, whispering careful advice into Kaelin's ear, making himself indispensable to a prince who trusted too easily beneath his guarded exterior, and now a servant boy with soft eyes and a quiet voice was undoing years of careful work simply by existing. He watched from the shadows of the west corridor as Kaelin laughed softly at something Rian had said, an actual laugh, unguarded and warm, the kind of laugh Ashbourne had never once managed to draw from him despite years of practiced charm. That single sound settled something dangerous and decisive in Ashbourne's chest. A bond that strong, if left to grow unchecked, would eventually threaten every plan he had spent years building toward the throne, and he decided, standing there in the shadows with his hands clasped calmly behind his back, that this problem needed to be removed before it could grow any further. He began quietly that same week, planting small seeds of doubt among the palace staff, suggesting in careful whispers that the boy the prince had purchased seemed to know too much about court matters for someone with no formal education, that he asked too many questions in the kitchens, that his sudden closeness to Kaelin seemed less like affection and more like calculated positioning. The whispers spread slowly at first, the way poison always does, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike with full force. Rian felt the shift before he understood its source, noticing servants who once greeted him warmly now offering only tight, uncertain smiles, noticing glances exchanged behind his back that stopped the moment he turned around. He recognized this pattern immediately, having lived through its earlier stages in lifetimes long past, and a familiar dread settled heavy in his stomach, the same dread that had always preceded the moment everything fell apart. He said nothing to Kaelin at first, not wanting to seem paranoid over something he could not yet prove, but he began paying closer attention to Ashbourne during court gatherings, watching the practiced ease with which the Duke moved through rooms full of powerful people, noticing the way his eyes lingered coldly on Rian whenever he believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. The trap, when it finally came, arrived with careful precision. Ashbourne arranged for a forged letter to be discovered in the servants' quarters, a letter written in handwriting cleverly disguised to resemble Rian's own, containing details about palace defenses and the prince's private schedule, details that suggested the boy had been secretly gathering information to pass along to a rival kingdom. The letter was placed exactly where a suspicious guard would find it during a routine inspection, and within hours, the accusation had reached Kaelin's private chambers, delivered by Ashbourne himself with a carefully arranged expression of reluctant concern. "I did not want to believe it," Ashbourne said softly, watching Kaelin's face carefully for any crack in his composure. "But the evidence troubled me too greatly to stay silent. I know how much you have come to trust him, and it pains me deeply to be the one bringing this to your attention." Kaelin read the letter twice, his jaw tightening, something cold and familiar creeping back into his chest, the same armor he had spent years building before Rian had slowly, patiently begun dismantling it piece by piece. "Bring him to me," he said finally, his voice flat, though something underneath it trembled faintly with a pain he refused to acknowledge even to himself. When Rian was brought before him in the throne room, flanked by two guards with expressions carefully blank, he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him all at once, the terrible familiar shape of this exact moment repeating itself yet again, Kaelin's eyes cold and distant, the letter trembling slightly in his tightened grip, Ashbourne standing just behind the throne with an expression of practiced sorrow that did not reach his calculating eyes. "I did not write that letter," Rian said clearly, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest, steady because he had promised himself, lying awake that very first night in the palace, that this time would be different. "I have never sought anything from you except your peace, your highness. I have nothing to gain from betraying you and everything to lose." Kaelin's expression remained unreadable, though something behind his eyes flickered uncertainly, caught between the trust that had grown slowly over recent weeks and the cold suspicion that years of betrayal had trained into him as a matter of survival. "The evidence says otherwise," he said quietly, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. It was in this moment that Soren stepped forward from where he stood guarding the throne room doors, his expression firm with quiet determination. "Your Highness, if I may speak. I have watched Rian closely these past weeks, and I noticed something troubling only this morning that I believe deserves your attention before any judgment is passed." Kaelin's eyes turned toward him sharply, and Soren continued without hesitation, having spent the entire morning quietly gathering proof after noticing Ashbourne's private steward disposing of scraps of parchment matching the letter's expensive paper stock, paper that servants of Rian's low station would never have access to in the first place. He presented the scraps now, along with testimony from 2 kitchen staff who had witnessed Ashbourne's steward slipping into the servants' quarters late at night, exactly where the forged letter had later been discovered. The throne room fell into heavy silence as Kaelin examined the evidence, his hands steady now with a different kind of resolve, the cold suspicion in his eyes slowly transforming into something far more dangerous directed entirely at the man standing behind his throne. He turned slowly toward Ashbourne, whose practiced expression of sorrow had begun to crack slightly at the edges. "Explain this," Kaelin said, his voice low and deadly quiet in a way that made the entire court hold its breath. Ashbourne opened his mouth to offer some smooth explanation, some clever redirection. He had surely prepared for exactly this possibility, but before he could speak, Rian stepped forward calmly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent throne room, steady with a certainty that came from having lived this exact betrayal before and refusing, this time, to let it win. "He has done this before," Rian said, and though he could not explain the full truth of his memories to this entire court, he spoke with a conviction that made every word land heavy and true. "Not to me directly in this lifetime, but I have seen men like him before, men who smile warmly while quietly poisoning every good thing near them because trust in others threatens the power they have built for themselves. Ask his steward under oath, Your Highness. Ask why expensive parchment matching that letter disappeared from the Duke's private study 3 days before it was discovered in the servants' quarters." Guards were dispatched immediately, and within the hour, Ashbourne's trembling steward confirmed everything under the weight of formal questioning, revealing the entire scheme in exchange for leniency, describing how Ashbourne had dictated the forged letter word for word and instructed him exactly where to plant it. The court erupted into murmurs of shock and disbelief as the truth unfolded completely, and Ashbourne, seeing no escape remaining, finally dropped his practiced mask entirely, his expression twisting into something bitter and cold. "You were always going to be replaced eventually," Ashbourne spat toward the throne, no longer bothering to hide his contempt. "A prince who lets his heart soften becomes a prince too weak to rule. I was only protecting the crown from itself." Kaelin rose slowly from his throne, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that silenced every whisper instantly. "You mistake cruelty for strength," he said, his voice steady and cold in a way that finally matched the title people had feared him for, though now it carried purpose rather than emptiness. "A crown built on lies crumbles eventually. I would rather rule with a heart intact than sit safely upon a throne built from other people's suffering." Ashbourne was stripped of his title before the sun set that same day, escorted from the palace grounds under heavy guard, his years of careful scheming unraveled completely in a single afternoon, and as the heavy palace gates closed behind him for the final time, something in Kaelin finally released, a weight he had carried since childhood, the fear of trusting deeply only to be destroyed by that same trust. That evening, as the sky burned brilliant shades of orange and gold above the palace gardens, Kaelin found Rian standing quietly beneath the jasmine trees, the same flowers that had once triggered a memory Rian could never fully explain. Kaelin walked toward him slowly, his usual guarded posture softened completely, and reached for Rian's hand with a gentleness that spoke louder than any words could have managed. "I do not know why I trust you as deeply as I do," Kaelin said softly, his eyes searching Rian's face with quiet wonder. "It feels sometimes as though I have known you far longer than these past weeks would explain, as though some part of me recognized you the very moment I saw you on that stage." Rian's heart swelled gently with a hope centuries in the making, tears gathering quietly at the corners of his eyes, though these were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Perhaps some hearts simply remember each other," he said softly, choosing his words carefully, even when the mind cannot explain why. Kalen smiled then, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind Rian had waited lifetimes to see fully bloom across his face without fear or hesitation holding it back. Then let us build something worth remembering, he said quietly, pulling Rian gently closer beneath the fading light. No matter what tries to come between us again, I choose you, fully and completely, starting today. And beneath the jasmine trees, with the sun setting warmly behind them and the garden finally quiet and peaceful after so much turmoil, Rian allowed himself, for the first time across every lifetime he could remember, to simply feel safe, to simply feel loved without condition, knowing that whatever lifetimes may come after this one, this love had finally found its way home. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to subscribe for more beautiful BL romance tales full of healing, loyalty, and love that survives absolutely everything.